Hi, I'm Kartika, a fellow learner who's excited by all things heritage and is forever curious to know more about the many forms in which heritage shapes our everyday lives. I tagged along with Team Inherit as they traveled far and wide to gather stories about our country's natural and culinary heritage. In the previous episode on culinary heritage, we explored the ancient cooking technique of leaf-wrapped cooking, which, if you haven't explored already, please do so. But jumping back now to the theme of natural heritage, we look at a region much farther away from Kaziranga, but way closer to Mangalore, the ancient Blue Mountains of our country. Yes, I am talking about the Nilgiris, a place where one truly realizes the meaning of the word heterogeneity. You'll find out what I'm talking about soon enough.
The Nilgiris, the name itself is, how I would start, because Nil means blue and Giri means mountain, and it's very simply put as the Blue Mountains. And there are several understandings about why it's called Nilgiris, of why that name has come. But one that I like to use is the fact that every 12 years there's this spectacular bloom of this plant called Kurinji, which has blue flowers, and then the mountains are covered with this flower. And it's a plant that's there all across our Western Ghats, and the Nilgiris is a part of the Western Ghats. And so the Nilgiris is a massive and one of the most ancient landscapes of India. It's got an altitudinal gradient from 2,000 meters to 300 meters. Therefore, several of the forest types of India can be found here.
The Nilgiris is like a multi-storied section of plateaus, and if you have to visualize the whole Nilgiri region, there are several plateaus placed at different heights. A very interesting feature is that because of all this heterogeneity in the land, the climate and settings also vary a lot. For example, you can go to a place that receives less than 500 mm of rainfall a year to a place that receives close to 8,000 mm of rainfall a year within a distance of 30 kilometers as the crow flies. So that's the level of heterogeneity that you can find in this landscape. And all of this has allowed the landscape to support close to 6 different ecotypes, forest and ecotypes. And for example, you have the Shola grassland ecology, which is there in the upper plateau. You have the evergreen forests, which are similar to rainforests, seasonally wet rainforests in the westernmost parts, where you have Silent Valley and a national park. And then you have the moist deciduous forests, and then you have the dry deciduous forests. You have mixed evergreen forests, and then you have a scrub jungle and savanna, which is also extremely beautiful. So all of this is packed together in a landscape that's not more than 5,000 square kilometers.
Most of them, as visitors or travelers who come into the Nilgiris, think, it's cool, it's the Shola forest, where most of us kind of, do not look the Nilgiris in this larger kind of a angle. It's like, just the Nilgiris is Ooty, Kuno, and the Shola forest or the grasslands.
Well, they're absolutely right. Until my visit, where I really got to understand the landscape, I also largely associated the Nilgiris with just Ooty and the surrounding areas. But the Nilgiris Biosphere Reserve is spread across the borders of 3 Indian states, Karnataka, Kerala and Tamil Nadu. Because of the geographical location, one can hear multiple languages being spoken in the region, right from Tamil, Malayalam and Kannada to Telugu, Urdu and Badaga. And these are just the most commonly spoken ones. The list is certainly longer. And this heterogeneity is not just limited to languages, but shows up in the flora and fauna of the region as well. Did you know that the NBR is home to over 30% of the country's endemic flora and fauna?
There are several native species, all of which are special in the Nilgiris Biosphere. There are close to 3,500 species of plants, and all of which are really important. There are several endemic species. For example, just outside you'll see this golden Kurinji, which is endemic to the Nilgiris. It flowers once in 9 years. And it's part of the Kurinji family, which is also quite specific to the hills of southern India.
It's been one of those unique landscapes for the country where I think some of the census figures put about 500 or more tigers in the wild, living in close proximity or living along with communities. So it's also a landscape that speaks about coexistence. And coexistence does not mean there's no tension. It does not mean the absence of conflict. Okay, it just means that each party is learning how to live with the other. As ancient as the Nilgiris is, so are the cultures that live here. There are numerous Adivasi and indigenous communities that are an integral part of this landscape. There's one actually then lived in the forests, evergreen forests, and one saw how forest-dependent communities were actually totally self-sufficient, and the forest was also doing good. So there was a relationship where man was not the was not the destroyer of the forest, that there was such a role for human beings in nature. And I think that was the start of this understanding about the relationship between people and nature.
And there are close to 12 to 16 different types of different groups of indigenous people, all with their own distinct languages and distinct ways of life, and all interacting with each other too, and that lived in this landscape.
Oral traditions and texts from Sangam literature reflect this interdependence of language and landscape. And this is a fascinating topic to explore, but moving on from linguistics to lifestyle, we all keep talking about living sustainably, but the communities living in the Nilgiris truly imbibe the spirit. Most of them are dependent on forests and natural ecosystems for their livelihoods and are quite aware of it. So how does this awareness make them strive to coexist with the landscape and do so without any or much disruption?
The three principles that really have to come together when one is trying to do that is that the ecology is met, the equity part is kept, and the economy is addressed. So for instance, there is what we call non-timber forest products, and those are actually products that come from the forest, like honey or aula, or it could be shikakai, which is a local soap product. Going forward, so then the question, okay, if somebody is dependent on the forests and when they keep extracting from the forest, does that mean that the forest is reducing, getting degraded? What happens to the forest? So always the question that as you remove, how does this impact the tree, the climber, the bee? And studying the ecology of these species to find out that there's actually a way to do this sustainably. So sustainable harvests are possible. Starting points was to work with forest produce, and wild honey was the entry point. And in that, local communities' knowledge about the ecology of the bees, the status of the forest, the conditions of the bees themselves, all of that was something that we studied and looked into. How does one handle the honey in such a way that it is also hygienically handled, and how can it reach the market so that the consumer also gets a product that is as close to nature as it can be? And in a third aspect, how do communities that do this ancient practice of honey collection from the wild, how do they get a fair livelihood and how are they participating and engaging with the market?
Bees, native bees, we have 4 different kinds of honey producing bees. One is the giant rock bee, Apis dorsata, then the Apis cerana, which we in modern times we do beekeeping is done with Apis cerana, and we have the dwarf bee, which is Apis florea, and the stingless bees, the Tetragonella species. So this also you can find them at different altitudinal variations in the Nilgiris, and mostly the stingless bees are found from the lower elevation, from the plains to a mid elevation. So with Florea also, but in the recent times we have seen Florea in this higher elevation, and yeah, Serana. Beekeeping is with Serana as well as with the stingless bees. And Serana, if you look into the historically, like in the Nilgiris, we would say, like, traditionally, the Tota community had practiced beekeeping with Apis cerana, where they would, if they would have seen a cavity with bees, they would kind of, prepare their colony, the cavity, and then, harvest that at the right time, and then kind of, which is carried on to the next generation. So which was hereditary. It's owned by the family, and then the generation kind of, used to take care of it. So that was a practice.
Since the bees actually migrate to the mountains during our summer periods when things are flowering here, and then they migrate out towards the plains when the rains come. Now all of this depends on the flowering here in the mountains. And so many times we've seen that when there have been disruptive years, when there's been a heat wave or there's been monsoon the rains have come right from February. So it affects the flowering cycle, and that definitely affects the movement of the bees. But nobody knows the answers. What happens to the bees in those years? Do their populations cut down drastically? What's happening there is still things that we don't understand, but we do definitely see this. And the people who bring that news to us first will be the people who collect the honey, because they're watching it, right? So there have been times when they say, we don't know what's happening out there. Half the tree is flowering, another half is not flowering. One branch is flowering, the other is not. Fruit has set, flower. So a lot of things have gone wrong in the system. And the honey collectors and hunters have seen this going wrong. And they're also thinking, what will the bees do? What food will the bees have at this time?
With beekeeping is, because we find this animal movement in urban spaces and also into the settlements where, especially with bear, where it comes and raids the colony. So unless you have a kind of a protection where it's fully caged, that we are not able to kind of, protect the bee boxes, or it's get raided by the bears. During the honey season, which is usually in the month of May, June, July, and then the communities do collect honey from Apis dorsata in the wild. And when they collect the honey, and it's kind of, in some cases it's value added, and it's kind of, just filtered, and it's bottled in the market chain. Gene pool of the Apis dorsata colonies is, they have these sacred cliffs. And these sacred cliffs, the honey on the sacred cliffs, in most cases, they are not harvested. It's considered sacred. And while they are even though when they are harvesting, it's not the whole, the number of colonies which is present on these cliffs are harvested. It's like, there's 1 or 2 colonies which is just, it's left, it's untouched, so that, there is this, the multiplication of this colony, and then there's the gene pool kind of kept intact.
There's a direct relationship. They produce honey, communities harvest the honey, communities understand the ecology of those bees. But there's a whole range of bees that are here doing a very essential system of pollination. There are the solitary bees. There are bees that have probably not been documented enough in this landscape. And one of the biggest roles I would say that the insects are playing is the pollination. If we have so much forest, we also have to have a system by which this forest continues, right? It continues to generate seeds, it continues to flourish. And the pollinators play a very big role in that. Some of the dominant communities, or I don't mean dominant in terms of numbers, but those who've had an older presence in this landscape are the Toda, the Kota, the Kurumba, the Irula, the Badiga. All of these communities who lived in a very close-knit way in this landscape.
Toda people, they are pastoralists, and they consider that the land is sacred and it's alive, and they never dig the land, they never dig the ground, and so they don't practice agriculture because of that. And so I've always felt that this was a very important and sacred point of view. There is a community called the Kota people, and they also live in the upper plateau of the Nilgiris, and they are traditionally the artisans and musicians of the Nilgiris, and the men, they are the blacksmiths. They practice metalworks, and they do carpentry, and they build. They are like the traditional masons, and the women are potters, and it's only the women who can practice pottery, and they collect the clay from wetlands, and they also consider the wetlands as sacred, and so they practice a form of sustainable harvesting of clay, and they never collect too much, and there's always a ceremony around it, and the clay is very rich in carbon, so it's dark and it's black, and all the pottery is also black in color because of that. Another very interesting community is the Cholanayakan people, and there's less than 200 people remaining. They're probably the most endangered in that sense, and they live in the rainforest region, and they build their houses in steep rock faces and on top of rock boulders, and they're the last remaining hunter-gatherer communities in mainland India. So they still hold on to their practices of fishing and hunting for small game in the forest, and foraging tubers and collecting leaves. So these are ways, and essential ways, in which we can see that they had sustainability that was ingrained in the ways they lived, and it wasn't a concept for them, it was just the way that they lived.
I've been lucky to live here for 30 years. And even today, I find you can get the whole spectrum of this traditional and modern lifestyle. So there are communities who sometimes when I go to those settlements, I think this is what it was like 30 years ago when I first saw them. So they continue and they choose to live that lifestyle. And there are communities who have also opted for another way of life, whether you call it modern or whatever, but there's another way of life.
As it's oral, and in a way kind of, preserving their traditional knowledge which they have, and then also to understand, like, how it is in the present kind of times, where there is slight delay in the flowering or the rainfall pattern. Did they observe it? They would have a story. Maybe it's something we can kind of, understand from each other, to understand, like, is it a pattern, or it's kind of, is it normal? Yeah, so there are many things to understand from there.
Being exposed to nature and the environment is essential at all ages, from the time you're born, and as we grow up, we can see it with the indigenous community. So, for example, when a Toda child is born, the first time when they bring the child out to the open, the first thing they show the child is the moon and the mountain and the forests and the trees. Is the first time when the child is like opens their eyes to the environment, is to introduce the child to these elements.
While it is extremely remarkable how these communities keep their traditions alive, we have to acknowledge how, in today's day and age, it isn't easy to draw this balance between keeping your traditions alive against rapid modernization and urbanization.
And I think for those who have kept the traditional, it's also because they have access to their forests, they have access to their rivers, they have access to their lands. So that helps them keep the traditional ways of life going. For those, some who have lost a lot, there have been communities who have been displaced, who have been resettled. So communities that have resettled have also perhaps chosen another way of life because they don't have access to those resources which they used to have.
Because the younger generation, they go in education, they're away from the village. And the youth, they move into other places for employment. So slowly kind of, there are some which is within them, but as like, as stories which they would share. But practically, some of them, they are not getting a chance to kind of, practice all this. So it's still kind of, slowly, it's in their mind, it's within them, but, it kind of slowly, there's a loss in certain fields.
This challenge has a consequence, not just on the people inhabiting the Nilgiris, but the landscape itself. It is critical that this urgency is realized, and the responsibility of protection and preservation goes way beyond the people who live there.
The Nilgiris, as it is such a, it's almost 70% under forest cover. And as you know, forests are managed as a state subject, as a national subject. So it's not that communities have very much say in how conservation of forests are managed. Yeah. So, so while communities are custodians of all this knowledge, they have interacted with the forest, the management of it and the conservation measures of it, at least for the last 100 years, has not been in their hands. It's been taken away, whether it was a colonial management or the later, with the Indian government. Yeah?
We need to urgently restore degraded lands and lands everywhere as much as possible, and there is a lot of scope for it. And firstly, the forest areas, like reserve forest areas in most parts of India, are at various stages of being altered or worked, and hence the health of the forests invariably need to be improved, and the resilience needs to be enhanced. And we drastically need to increase the amount of grassland, shrubland and forest cover in our country, and corridors for animals, plants and insects and several other species need to form and increase.
So for instance, a landscape like the Nilgiris, which is such a highly protected and such a special landscape, but only 14% of this landscape is actually under townships and urban areas. The rest remains as forests. So in many ways, there has to be a sort of boundary to the development, and I think that helps. And people always compare with what's happening in the Nilgiris vis-a-vis what's happening in the Himalayas, for instance. The Himalayas is a much more fragile and much more newer mountain. The Nilgiris is an older mountain and therefore takes a lot of the strain of whatever development activities are happening. But we see a lot more natural disasters in the Himalayan landscape. So just because there are no natural disasters here doesn't, how long can we go on like this? How long can we, push those boundaries? climate phenomena that's been happening here. There's a lot more natural disasters, whether it's landslides, flash floods. And these we could link to extreme weather events. We could link it to climate change. But if you ask traditional communities, they'll say the climate has always been changing, the weather has always been predictable, there have been cycles of drought and heavy rain. So, so in this context, there's definitely a lot more pressure on the landscape, because what wasn't there in the past was this rapid urbanization. And today, the road infrastructure, all the infrastructure that's coming into the district, the retaining walls, the concrete, and definitely one of the largest impacts of human presence has been the trash, the garbage, So all of this waste that's coming into this landscape, and we're not being able to manage it. All of these pressures, along with what's happening with the climate, is definitely a formula for some kind of, let's say, a huge disbalance between conservation needs and development needs.
We will be crossing a tipping point with this, because if ecosystems collapse and if more trees die and forest fires increase, the tipping point of ecosystems being a carbon sink to a source can happen very rapidly. And so it's in these spaces that we understand that the situation is really, really urgent, and that everyone needs to look at this and understand these dynamics to be in touch with what's needed and what's happening. To learn in terms of best practices and various solutions, and so a lot of attention needs to be put into observing and learning and trying and practicing and communicating. Advocacy is also needed, and storytelling is needed, because clearly the most dominant forms of information going out of here is just the pretty spaces and the climate, and it's drawing a lot of tourists and a lot of attention, and but that needs to change, and we need to sensitize people here visiting here, as well as people willing to engage with the story of this landscape, to learn about how we need to be engaging with our landscapes all over.
There is one essential point to note when learning about natural heritage. It's not something hidden away in hills or within the seas. What happens in the natural world affects us, and our behaviors and practices here affects whatever happens there. The distance may seem great, but so is our interconnectedness.
I was reading something the other day, which is about how basically what happens in the forest impacts the oceans. So it's actually the oceans naturally do not have certain minerals that are required for life to form, like the phytoplanktons, which are the most important chain. So what happens in the forest when leaves form detrital matter and they leach into rivers, and that nitrogen and phosphorus and all of these minerals that go via rivers into the oceans actually support a life in the oceans. And I think this interconnected nature of life is what actually we learned from being with communities here. So even if you are living in the city, I think everybody now understands climate, right? How climate impacts your life, whether you live in the forest, whether you live in the city. And I think when we understand those impacts, we also have to understand our connectedness. We have to know how we are connected to every element. And I think understanding those connections, it could be a simple thing like where do you get your food from? Just don't think that it just comes from out of a store or a package, right? So where do you get your food from? Where do you get your, so many of India is big on Ayurvedic products. Yeah. Do we ever think what supports it? These are not products that are grown. These are products which are harvested from forests. So for us to say that we're not connected to anything else is because we haven't asked or we haven't looked at those connections.